On the 2nd of April 1955, at around 9 p.m. on Easter Sunday night, 25-year-old David Blakely parked his race car outside a pub in Hampstead, London. He arrived with his friend Clive, and both tipsy from earlier partying, they walked into the pub and exchanged casual hellos with the regulars. David cashed a cheque for £5 and the two settled in with their drinks. After a few rounds, they decided to head back to the party, ordering cigarettes and a flagon of beer to take with them. As they were finishing their drinks, a blonde woman wearing thick black glasses and a grey suit stood outside the window watching them. Though others inside the pub noticed her watching, neither man did. Outside, Clive waited by the car as David fumbled for his keys, only to hear a voice calling his name. David ignored it, and he carried on searching for his keys. As the woman approached, she pulled a revolver from her bag and aimed it at him. David, caught by surprise, ran behind the car as shots rang out, blood splattering the vehicle. Clutching the flagon of beer as he staggered, calling for Clive as he tried to escape the gunfire, the woman went after David, following around the side of the car, telling Clive, "Get out of the way," as Clive stood frozen in shock. As David clambered away from the gunshots, he slumped onto the pavement outside the pub, blood pooling from his mouth. Misaimed bullets were fired at his back as he laid on the ground. A bank official and his wife were entering the pub when the wife's hand was mistakenly shot from the subordinate aim. The woman continued to shoot at David, though the gun was out of bullets. Onlookers rushed to the scene, shouting for help. She stood watching David gurgle blood, and with a vacant expression, she calmly turned to Clive and told him to call the police. Clive raced into the pub, and he called out for someone to help. The woman, now out of bullets, stood silently, watching David writhe. As a police officer approached from the pub, she showed no emotion as he disarmed her. Emergency services arrived, but it was too late. David had passed away. The woman felt a sense of relief as she was taken into custody, her vacant expression leaving a chilling silence behind as the crowd of onlookers observed in horror at the lifeless body on the ground. The woman in question went on to be known in the UK as the last woman to be hung. An uproar and controversy followed the news of her sentencing, with protests using her case to aid the abolishment of capital punishment altogether. The aftermath of her hanging inflicted unbearable grief and tragedy amongst most of those closely related to the case. This is part 1 of the story of Ruth Ellis. Ruth Neilson was born during a turbulent sandstorm on the 9th of October 1926 in Rhyl, North Wales. On the coast of the Irish Sea, Rhyl was known as an elegant Victorian seaside town, a popular tourist destination bringing holidaymakers from Liverpool to Rhyl's Victoria Pier, built in 1867, the first pier in North Wales. Rhyl housed St Mary's Convent School. Founded in the year 1899, it was a high school promising that special attention would be paid to the moral training of children, and it famously sheltered Belgian refugees in 1914. Hosting the first ever floodlit football match in Wales, Rhyl is a town full of history. Ruth was born into a lower middle class family. Ruth's mother Bertha was a refugee from Belgium, and she came to England during World War I, and here she would meet Ruth's father Arthur. Arthur grew up in Manchester, but together the couple would settle in Rhyl, a location with the simplicity to travel to the port of Liverpool, as Arthur was a cello player on the Atlantic liners. Arthur would also play in an orchestra in theatres around the UK. Ruth was one of 5 siblings, having equally 2 sisters and 2 brothers. The family, like many at that time, struggled with keeping afloat during the tough times. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and with the severe economic downturn affecting industrial trade and production, loss of economic profits, and unemployment, the family of 7, and supported solely by their musician father, new decisions would need to be made to keep the family afloat. So in 1933, when Ruth was 7 years old, the family relocated to Basingstoke, a town in Hampshire in England. The population in Basingstoke sat at around 14,000 residents around that time, and being considered one of the safer areas to shelter in by the time World War II began. Though a musician, in Basingstoke Arthur took on the job as a porter at the Park Pruitt Mental Hospital, a psychiatric hospital where legendary cricket commentator John Arlott worked as a records clerk during this time too. The family settled adequately in Basingstoke, with Arthur at work, Ruth and her siblings attending school, and Bertha taking care of the home. Ruth attended a Roman Catholic Sunday school growing up, but when it came to her education at Fairfield Senior Girls' School, she struggled. Ruth's ability to read and write was consistently below standard for her age, and though she wasn't far from being considered illiterate, you couldn't easily perceive that she was intellectually challenged as she grew into a young lady. Ruth hated to be poor, and she also hated boys. Growing up, Ruth would dress in her mother's clothes, conceptualizing the idea of being wealthy. She showed an everlasting ambition to achieve the status of a woman of wealth who wore nice clothes. At the age of 14, Ruth and her family relocated, as did many families during this time. World War II was underway, and the Nielsen family settled in Reading in England. Ruth would no longer attend school. Instead, she took on her first job as a waitress at a local cafe. A 14-year-old Ruth would bring home her tips, gazing at the money laid out on the table with stars in her eyes. There was no stopping her now. Any nice clothes that Ruth found any capability in affording from her wages, they were hers. The excitement of living up to her own expectations of herself, to one day be that woman of wealth, wearing the nice clothes, it was all seeming more and more within reach now that she had a job. The only hindrance was that Ruth had to spend her money. Though she beamed with ambition, telling her family of how she'll one day own restaurants, she'll own a chain of restaurants, there just seemed to be no prospect of getting there with her inability to save any of the money that she earned. But none of that mattered for now, not for 14-year-old Ruth. This was her first taste of what life could be like moving forward. In 1941, when she was 15 years old, Ruth's father Arthur took on a new job as a chauffeur in Southwark, London, and so the family relocated once again. London was subjected to bombings during this time in the war, and one day, as a bomb dropped much too close to Ruth's father Arthur, their new family home was destroyed. And Ruth, being nearby at the time, put all her strength into pulling her severely injured father away to safety. Arthur was unable to work after the bombing, and now with nowhere to live, the Nielsens moved to another property close by in Camberwell, Suffolk. Ruth and her siblings sought out employment to keep the family afloat. Ruth took on a job as a machine minder, operating factory machines. Though she was earning money, Ruth wasn't impressed with her circumstances. She was destined for bigger things than this, and though she didn't particularly like the job, she took pride in her work. Ruth believed that her female co-workers were jealous of her, for how much better that she was at the job than they were. They saw her as stuck up, but regardless of the weak relationships with her co-workers, Ruth was still earning money, and she was content enough with her circumstances for now. Her new stability wouldn't last long though, and in 1942, at the age of 16, Ruth was diagnosed with rheumatic fever, an inflammatory disease that was fairly common at the time, but though it was common, it did have devastating effects on many sufferers. Ruth spent some months in hospital, and though incredibly poorly at one stage, with her hair turning darker and her figure becoming ever more slight, Ruth was finally discharged from care with the recommendation to take up dancing to aid her recovery. A recommendation that she would follow was zest, and though Ruth wasn't particularly good at it, she took a love in dancing. With her enthusiasm and ambition reignited, Ruth ditched her job at the factory to work at the Lyceum Ballroom Theatre in Westminster as a photographer's assistant. Ruth was known as a Brixton girl, but her new areas for adventure would arouse her ambitions to make something of herself. She was now a regular in the West End area of London, a prime entertainment district with a vibrant nightlife, given the abundance of jazz clubs and stylish cafes, and in the daytime, it was a haven for mid to luxury shopping. And this is where Ruth could window shop to her heart's content, and sometimes, when the wages would allow it, even purchase for real. Next to the West End was Soho, where immigrants, artists, musicians, writers and beyond would unite in the diverse and cosmopolitan character of the bohemian atmosphere. Soho had a thriving underground scene, becoming the birthplace of rock and roll scene in the UK and home to iconic jazz clubs. Soho was the place to be. Some streets around parts of Soho were lined with strip clubs. They had adult cinemas, private clubs, and this is where the more risque behaviour and adult enjoyment would take place. But only a small part of Soho had an essence that was seedy. It was an area that would cater for all. And finally, the most upper-class neighbourhood of the lot was Mayfair. Mayfair was an area for affluence and wealth, the home of aristocracy, diplomats and wealthy business figures, an area known for its grand Georgian houses, private clubs and luxury hotels. You'd go to Mayfair for the finest tailor suits, or the jewellery stores, or to visit the famed art galleries. It was whilst working at the Lyceum Theatre, at 17 years old, Ruth met a French-Canadian soldier named Claire. The theatre was frequented by servicemen on leave, and that's how Claire found himself in attendance. Claire was a decade older than Ruth at the time, but she found him endearing and handsome, and when she brought him home to meet the family, he was warmly welcomed, and soon the couple got engaged. Claire would take Ruth to restaurants in Soho, giving him money to spend, and with Ruth relishing in the more upper-crust experiences that she couldn't afford to enjoy on her machine-operating wage, she was very happy indeed. Her ambitions were slowly being fulfilled, and though they were a far stretch from being fully accomplished, Ruth was enjoying living her new chapter, working and experiencing the West End of London. Ruth was thriving, until she fell pregnant. Things would come crashing down when it was revealed that Claire was already married. His wife lived in Canada with their 2 children, a revelation that did not come from Claire, but from his commanding officer, and it all came out when Ruth's mother decided to write to him once the prospect of setting a date for marriage arose. The whole situation was disastrous for Ruth, and with her mother banishing Claire away, her security was wiped away with him, leaving a devastation behind now that Ruth was experiencing heartbreak and deceit. She had no choice but to start providing for herself closer to home, landing a job in a cafe, this time working as the cashier so that she could sit down during work as her pregnancy would progress. As Ruth healed from her heartbreak, she became emotionally guarded and cold. Her trust in men was gone. She would not let a man deceive her again. She hated men. She hated them. In September 1944, Ruth's son was born, and she named him Claire Andrea Nielsen. Though she hated Claire after what he did to her, he would still visit the family when their son was first born. He'd give them money, and he would try to stay involved. But this didn't change anything for Ruth. She would tell people that she met that her son's father was a US pilot killed in the war. Her bitterness continued, as did his gifts and attempts to reconcile. It was no use, and Claire returned to Canada once the war ended, and when Claire left, his money left with him. Ruth decided to stay home with the baby, but she did still need to work. So without having to rely on childcare in the daytime to go out to work, she worked at night. Ruth became a photographer's model at the Camera Club, where groups of photographers would take her picture, sometimes posing in anything but clothes. She was enamoured and captivated with her new wages. She was earning £1 an hour, which would be around £56 an hour in today's money. Ruth would often go with some of the photographers for a drink after shooting, and they would be paying for her evening out. While drinking at the Court Club just off of Oxford Street in Mayfair, location that would become of vast significance to Ruth's life, she lapped up the feeling of importance and elitism. In 1946, Ruth was introduced to the Court Club owner, a 59-year-old man named Maurice Connolly. He was overweight and displeasing, but as a multiple club owner and a big head in the game of the London nightlife, Ruth was drawn in to the potential this man could open doors to. However, Morris Conley was a man of corrupt money and his run-ins with the law. Morris Conley was raided at a premises that turned out to be a brothel that he was clearly running. Though he was caught by investigators at the premises, and with £400 cash in his pocket, which is over $22,000 in today's money, he denied having any involvement in the operation. For this, he received a £100 fine and a slap on the wrist. Morris Conley saw a potential in Ruth as one of his club's hostesses. He hired her for £5 a week with a 10% commission earned on the food and drinks ordered through her. She was provided free evening dresses to wear to work, feeding her love of nice clothes, and though there was a small expectation within the job that through enticing customers to pay for more and more, there was also the expectation to sleep with customers spending the most money. When the Court Club closed, the hostesses would continue their shift at his club just a few streets over until 2 a.m. Morris Conley ran the operation with purely business in mind, and the hostesses would charge more for their time to the customers who'd had just a bit too much to drink. It was a finely oiled machine. Regardless of how displeasing this aspect of the job was, the customers were more often or not very respectable businessmen. Many were manufacturers or sometimes owners of high-end clothing stores, and they would give Ruth nice dresses and clothes as part of an exchange for her services. She was meeting lots of higher influenced men that she might not have anywhere else, and best of all, Ruth was earning upwards of £20 a week within no time. Ruth spent her evenings working late into the night, carrying on the night after work with customers taking her out around Soho and Mayfair. With her son at home with her family, she took all the time that she needed to go out and really enjoy herself. She needed the time to enjoy some of life. She was selling her body to fund her lifestyle after all. Ruth made a friend in one of the hostesses at the club, a girl named Valerie, who chose to go by the name Vicky at work. Vicky had a similar upbringing to Ruth, both from a lower social standing and struggling childhoods, starting work in their early teen years to support themselves living with far from well-off families. And though they both dreamed of money and nice clothes, Vicky had a different closing ambition than that of Ruth's, for she wanted to be a film star, a dream that Ruth would earlier give up on after finding that the singing and the dancing lessons she tried amounted to no progression and no hope in the arts due to her absent talents in the such. But Ruth and Vicky's common interests brought them together. They enjoyed using willing men for their one use, which was to pay for their evenings in swanky clubs and restaurants, funding the life that they more than anything wanted to maintain. Ruth and Vicky were lapping up the perks of surrounding themselves with the higher society men who either had ties to or could provide them with the means to obtain more luxurious and glamorous clothes. These post-war years had seen ladies' fashion revolutionized. They were now wearing more feminine shapes, not the harsher, more structured military-style clothes with their simple silhouettes and practical fabrics. Now the skirts were full, with waistlines emphasized, with a bodice to show a narrow waist and an hourglass silhouette. The dresses were now off the shoulder, or even strapless altogether. They were fabrics such as silk and velvet to be worn with pride, with beading, lace and embroidery details, none of the such that you would see wartime where the materials were rationed and sold for practicality. They could now dress sexy, elegant and feminine, and they loved to do so. Amongst the glitz and glam, there was another hiccup in the road when Ruth fell pregnant by one of her customers at the club. A fellow hostess pointed Ruth in the direction of a questionable clinic to terminate her 3-month-long fetus. Swiftly returning to work to continue like nothing had happened, she wasn't feeling 100% in herself. Ruth began to drink more and more to fabricate the entertaining demeanour at work. If Ruth wasn't entertaining the customers, they wouldn't spend as much of their money on food and drinks, and that would mean that they weren't spending their money on Ruth. So whether it be through bottles of champagne at the club or bringing her nice clothes, she found that if a tipple, sometimes many a tipple, would numb her feelings and enable her to perform at work, then so be it, even if it meant to having to do so every night. In 1950, at 24 years old, Ruth was introduced to a 41-year-old divorced man named George Ellis. George was a dental surgeon from Sanderstead. Back then, it was in the affluent area of Surrey, though now it's the Greater London district of Croydon. George lived alone. His wife and 2 children had left him due to his sometimes violent streak. He was lonely and isolated, and he yearned for married life since his wife and children left him. George was relatively wealthy from his proficient dental commissions during the war. Unfortunately for his patients, George was an alcoholic, and though they'd have to inhale the sickening stench of the cough sweets that he'd suckle on to mask the liquor on his breath, they would grin and bear it, for he was the one to cure their pain in the long run. At the Court Club, George would spend a lot of money, and though Ruth found his stories wild and literally unbelievable, she would spend time with George, because he was more than willing to spend money on Ruth. And though she lapped up the attention, aka money from George, she had other customers, and she couldn't stick the pestering from George while she was hosting other men. To get him off her case, Ruth told George to head over to the Hollywood, and she would meet him there later. But she didn't. She went to a party with Vicky, plans she had already made and always intended to stick to, regardless of what she told George. The next day at work, Ruth discovered that George had been attacked outside the Hollywood the night before. Feeling an immense guilt that she was the one who sent him there, and feeling indebted to him for what she had felt was her fault that he was slashed across the cheek with a razor blade waiting for her, that when George came into the Court Club that night and asked if he could take Ruth to dinner, she agreed. After dinner, they returned to work for Ruth to continue her shift, and after she finished, they went to the Astor Club in Mayfair to carry on a night of heavy drinking. They ended the night returning to George's home in Sanderstead. George told Ruth about how he'd gone out to play golf for the day and came back to find that his wife and his 2 children had left him. The once almost intolerable George became a regular in the company of Ruth, for now she felt even more sorry for him once she learnt of his troubles. Though the only aspect that she liked about George was the fact that he would shower her with gifts and swanky dinners, and buying her those nice clothes that she always yearned for. George even took Ruth away to Newquay in Cornwall for 3 months over the summer. One night was rather chaotic when George took Ruth on an open fishing boat along with a skipper and a crate of alcohol. Sailing into the night, safe to say, they were inebriated, which didn't help the situation when one of the engines blew out and George had to steer the turbulent boat while the skipper tried to rectify the issue. Though drunk as a skunk, the skipper had enough wits about him to realise they were out of fuel. They had no navigational aids to help them back. The 3 of them were just there, positively terrified. Ruth was doing her best to put the overflow of water back from where it came from as the waves ravaged her efforts by filling the boat up even more. As the rain came down and no prospect of getting back to safety, their prayers were answered when they were discovered by a fisherman who agreed to lend them the fuel to get back to shore. They eventually docked in St. Ives, and slightly traumatised from the experience, Ruth was very cross, but she was too tired to care about anything but getting into a warm hotel bed for a long, long sleep. When the trip came to an end, Ruth could not wait to get home. George still wanted to spend time with Ruth, so before she returned home to her son and back to work at the Court Club, they spent a few days at a hotel, and during their stay, they visited Croydon Airport, where George hired a plane to fly them in. Ruth trusted George enough to fly in the plane with him. After all, he had a pilot's license. But that trust soon relinquished when George decided to fly them upside down in loops, re-traumatizing Ruth all over again. The aftermath of their summer away and George's extensive spending to sustain his alcohol addiction, along with his depressive moods, it was all diminishing the glamour of Ruth's life, and they began arguing. Not just behind closed doors, but before observing eyes, just about anywhere in public. But albeit, she stuck with him. Eventually, Ruth decided to move in with George in Sanderstead. She wasn't in love with George, but she loved the idea of stability in her home life and to be a kept woman, not having to go out and do the unappealing job of selling herself to men in the club in order to afford the finer things that she yearned for. Ruth took her son to Surrey to live with George, and there they began their new chapter, living as a wholesome family unit. Upon arriving, they stumbled upon George's mother in the kitchen, who seemed rather confused as to who the unknown young lady walking in with his son was. The looks of disapproval from his mother were enough for him to introduce Ruth on spur of the moment as his new wife. Both Ruth and George's mother seemed taken aback by this news, but as Ruth looked at George's mother and realising that she had some wealth behind her, some wealth that inevitably could become hers one day if she was his wife, agreed with the story. They went on to introduce Ruth as George's new wife. They'd returned as newlyweds, though no such wedding or exchanging of vows or any signing of papers had taken place whatsoever. This was one way to conceal that they were living in sin, or at least to steer clear of any gossip or inquisition into their living situation from the nosy neighbours. Ruth and George would argue relentlessly. As George was an alcoholic, he of course spent a lot of money on liquor, money that could be spent on holidays or nice clothes for Ruth. Ruth knew that he liked to spend money at clubs, that's how they met, so she knew that he drank too much. But now they were living together, she tired of his antics, spending so much of what she believed was now their money on champagne. He was spending too much money on whatever was fancied at the time, leaving less money for everything else. George had money, but the way they had been spending it, it wouldn't last for much longer without George sorting out his problem with addiction. He sold his dental practice and voluntarily checked into a rehab facility in hopes of overcoming his alcoholism and enabling them to start afresh. Even though George had gone into rehab, the arguing between Ruth and George was relentless. Ruth found living on her own while George was in treatment miserable. She made it known, and with this, George checked out of rehab to take Ruth on holiday. Ruth was glad of the company and the time away together to fix her loneliness, but she wasn't glad of the fact that George was still drinking just as much as ever. She wanted George to get better, she wanted him to stop drinking and to be happier within himself, and she wanted him to work and live a normal life so that they could legitimately get married and live a wholesome family life. And whether it be because of money or not, she put effort into being supportive of George's recovery. On the 8th of November 1950, at the age of 24, Ruth married George Ellis. This was an agreement between the couple that he would return to rehab once they married. George lined up a job for when he'd completed his stay at the rehab facility. It would be a dental practice in Southampton. The job would involve working between 3 practices with his new boss. George, of course, did not disclose his past struggles with alcoholism, nor did he intend on having a drink at any time in the near future. But with the new job lined up, with his second stint in rehab completed, Ruth and George moved over an hour's drive to Warsash. Warsash is a small village near the coast of Southampton, with strong maritime ties and a beautiful countryside. They moved into a quaint 4-bedroom house. A newly house-proud Ruth ditched the glitz and the glamour to an extent, and she began dressing more demure, a suggested revolution against her once-was lifestyle of an S-worker at the court club. To others, they appeared as a well-to-do, put-together married couple. Ruth was happy with her new circumstances, and George was working to support them. He wasn't drinking, and she now had a nice home to tend to. And she wasn't having to work at the court club and sleep with different men every night, so life was good for Ruth. Life was good until George found the Rising Sun. The Rising Sun is a public house located close to the River Hamble, a positively marvellous place to have a drink, except he shouldn't have been drinking there at all. Ruth was enraged with George drinking once again. They began the relentless arguing once again, and no matter where they were, if an argument ensued, it was an argument for anyone around them to witness. Ruth began to feel more and more isolated as she was left home alone whilst George would go out drinking at the Rising Sun. George was drinking his troubles away. Sometimes she wouldn't even know where he was at all. If the Rising Sun had closed, George would find somewhere else to go to drink. And while Ruth was keeping the home, she longed for a support system. She lacked friends in the area. She'd met and become friendly with a few of the locals, but no friendship had developed strong enough to make her feel at home, or that she had someone to call when she was feeling low. Her feelings of loneliness and isolation only grew as George's drinking extended deep into the evenings after work, mostly away from home. Time would go on, George drinking incessantly, Ruth losing her temper, and vicious arguments between the couple, and non-stop animosity in the household. Before long, a blind rage was initiated inside of Ruth over a frivolous idea that George was having an affair. There wasn't a particular event or time that made Ruth grow suspicious. It was almost like the thought took over her one day. But from then on, Ruth had full confidence that George was cheating on her, and she was enraged over the idea. She was so enraged that she would go out of her way to catch him in the act. The idea consumed her that George was out cheating on her when he would go out drinking, or when he'd go out to work, or when he was at home alone. Pretty much anywhere that George went, Ruth was in a high-strung, panicked and enraged state over the thought that he was cheating on her. The unrelentless need to prove to herself that it was happening would have Ruth act out of character over and over again, to a point that in a way it became her character. Ruth began calling the dental practice to ask the receptionist if George was still at work and what his schedule was looking like for the day. And when she found out what time George was expected to finish work, she'd time how long she'd expect him to take to get home after. And if he wasn't home within good time, she would be consumed once again with the worry that he was out cheating on her. Neither Ruth nor George owned a car at this time. George had hired drivers to take him between London and Surrey for years, and since their move to Southampton, he'd been catching the bus to work, sometimes borrowing a car from work to get to A to B, but if the bus journey took longer than what Ruth anticipated, her mind would race, amped up and ready to confront George about his alleged affair. George had arranged to borrow the car from work one time. He was to collect it from the garage and he could use it from there until it needed to be returned. When George went to collect the car, the garage informed him that it wasn't quite ready yet, so he needed to go kill some time while they finished the car. So George went to the Rising Sun for a few drinks. Ruth had made herself aware of the plans and had called the garage asking if George was there when he hadn't returned home with the car when expected. But when she called, George was still out drinking at the Rising Sun because the car wasn't ready yet. But when George came back to the garage and heard that Ruth called for him, he himself was panicked. He rushed home believing something must be wrong, and when he got home, no one was there. He sat down and continued drinking in the house while he waited for his wife to return home. Ruth did show up after a short while, and she was driving a car that he'd not seen before. George asked where she'd been and asked whose car she was driving. Ruth told him that she had hired the car to go drive to one of his patients' home to catch him in the act, but seeing as no one was there and his car wasn't parked outside, she came home. A drunk and now mercilessly angry George launched into a violent attack upon Ruth for her actions. He wasn't always violent when he was drunk, but sometimes he couldn't control it, and he took his frustrations out on Ruth physically. Ruth didn't stop hiring cars to go hunting for George. She kept showing up at the dental practice to catch him having an affair at work, and George would get her back by hiring cars to drive up to the clubs in London to wind her up even more. George's drinking only got more and more out of control, eventually losing his job at the practice after going AWOL on a drinking adventure to the Isle of Wight, leaving patients waiting for him and his employers searching for him. Losing his job was the final straw for Ruth, who demanded that he sort himself out. And though George easily found himself a new position at a dental practice in Cornwall, Ruth wouldn't be joining him there. She took her son back to Brixton to stay with her parents for a while. It was into 1951 when the relationship had taken a turbulent turn for the worst. Ruth learned that she was pregnant. With George working and living in Cornwall and Ruth back in Brixton with her parents, the only way forward to support their growing family was to get back together, at least in Ruth's eyes. She begged George to give it another go and to allow her to come to Cornwall, that she would stop the accusation of affairs and stop dropping in on him at work to try and catch him out. She promised to let the jealousy go for the sake of their family. And though George agreed, Ruth couldn't stick to her promise. Something inside of her fueled the rage that she couldn't contain her instincts, And as the ferocious arguments continued, so did George's excessive drinking, and once again he checked back into rehab to battle his addiction. And now pregnant Ruth would fly off the handle, convinced that George was having an affair with other inpatients at the rehab, even convinced that he was having an affair with staff working at the hospital. He could not take it anymore. And although estranged from the marriage due to a stay in rehab and a refusal to see Ruth thereafter, George agreed to pay Ruth £16 a month child support for his daughter when she was born in October 1951. A month later, he filed for divorce, leaving Ruth devastated and heartbroken for the second time in her life, with her pure, unadulterated hatred for men reignited once again. A newly single mother of two, 25-year-old Ruth made the cataclysmic decision to go back to work at the Court Club. The life she thought that she'd escaped from, the life where she had to sleep with supposed well-to-do men to afford the finer things than that of simply a cafe waitress or a machine minder could afford. But she had no choice. If Ruth wanted to live above the means of what she had been capable of working elsewhere, working at the Court Club for Maurice Conley was her only option. Conley had added to the club's amenities, and they now had a cabaret show as well as a restaurant. Though sounding slightly classier than before, the club stayed open for an extra hour each night, and with that extra hour allowing for men to be ploughed with as much alcohol as the hostesses could persuade, that meant Ruth would not finish work until at least 3 a.m. each night. Even if she was leaving the club and returning straight home to her children in Tootenbeck, a few miles southwest of Brixton when the Nielsens had previously lived, her parents didn't seem to protest Ruth's job, though they were happier when she was being kept by George. Ruth's mother, Bertha, cared for the children while Ruth had to work, and even though she wouldn't finish until 3 a.m. some nights, Ruth would stay out later than that, just to carry on working with the men. And back doing what she did best, working at the clubs, with a fresh new look of bleach blonde hair and wearing her nice clothes, Ruth built back her happiness over time. Even though she felt back at square one, not so well off anymore now that George's dentist wage was out the picture, and back to working in the club being exploited by men once again, deep down she was happy in the club scene. It's all that she knew, and it's almost always had gotten her goals, if not for the setbacks in between. Club owner Maurice Conley offered a room for Ruth in Oxford Street in Mayfair. She'd live alongside the other hostesses from his clubs, and this was said to be a convenient place to conduct business, and a convenient part of Ruth's grand plan to be able to tell people that she lived in Mayfair. Since her financial status had gone back to square one since she left George, she felt extravagant once again. Alongside her new chapter of living in Mayfair came a new clientele to the Court Club, which had now been renamed Carol's amid the refurb and becoming a restaurant and a cabaret venue. Ruth enjoyed the new clientele. They were different to the usual business professionals she'd surrounded herself with previously at work. These men were motor racers. Motor racing was truly born in the late 1800s, with Australia creating the first purpose-built motor racing circuit set up in 1906, closely followed by the first purpose-built banked motor racing circus, opened in Surrey in 1907, hosting its last race in 1939 before becoming a base for wartime aircraft production. Today you can visit the site as part of a motor and aviation museum. At this time in 27-year-old Ruth's life, the post-war sports car racing was a fully fledged sport within its own right. With world championships to compete in, this would become at least a hobby for some, if not a dream for those who like to dabble in the sport. Some of the new men in Ruth's life included 23-year-old Mike Hawthorne, who was head of the Steering Wheels Motor Racing Club, and Desmond Cusson, another member of the racing club. They would meet at Carol's to let loose and unwind after tending to their motor vehicles and racing with stars in their eyes over the love of competing professionally. Ruth was drinking in Carol's off shift one day with her new acquaintances from the Steering Wheels Club. In particular, she was drinking with Desmond, when in walked a 5'9", dark-haired, handsome 24-year-old man named David Blakely. David was part of the Steering Wheels Club with Desmond. However, David didn't immediately approach them to say hello. Ruth saw David as snobby from the way he carried himself to the bar. hearing him make critical comments about the club and its patrons, and insinuating to others nearby that the hostesses were underwhelming. She felt he thought of himself as to be too good to be there, and Ruth didn't like this at all. Who did this man think he is? Ruth asked the men who the pompous ass was, asking intentionally loud enough to fall upon David's ears. Ruth had a thick skin by now. She was outspoken and forthright, and she refused to take any nonsense from men given the heartbreak that she'd experienced at the hands of the men who fathered her children. And whoever this obnoxious David Blakely was, she wasn't going to sit quietly as he insulted the environment she'd worked so hard to establish herself in. David looked towards Ruth and asked if she too was a hostess. She told him no, she was instead an old has-been. David, who clearly wasn't amused with this exchange, called on his fellow club members to leave with him, calling Carol's a sink of an iniquity, a term used to describe somewhere immoral activities take place. It was safe to say that David was not impressed by Carol's, nor was he impressed with the morals of the women who were working there. David left, leaving a sour taste behind from his condescending manner, and leaving Ruth wondering who exactly this man was. David Blakely was born on the 17th of June 1929 in Sheffield, England, to his Scottish father John and his Irish mother Annie. David was one of 4 children, growing up with his older brothers Derek and Brian and sister Maureen. Though living in a lower middle-class area, his father John was a Glaswegian doctor, practicing in Crooks, Sheffield. He was the most popular doctor in the area just after the war, caring for anyone necessary, even those who couldn't afford it. He would drive out in the middle of the night to treat those who needed it, allowing his patients to repay for his service at just over £1 a week in today's money. Whilst his father worked, David and his siblings were cared for by Nanny, who David felt was more of a mothering figure to him than Annie was. And though he wasn't particularly close to his parents, he loved them both dearly, and David was a happy child. Though an all-round happy childhood, scandal hit the family in 1934 when David was just 5 years old. David's father was suspected to be involved in the death of a young woman in his care. On the 10th of February 1934, a local newspaper reported of a young woman being driven home by an unknown vehicle and later dying in hospital. The Daily Herald reported as quoted, "The story of a dying girl being driven home in a motor which disappeared was told at the inquest yesterday at Sheffield on Phyllis Staton, aged 25, an unemployed waitress who died in hospital. The inquest was adjourned. The girl's father said that she had been keeping company with a professional man for 2 years. In the middle of January, she left home and he received 2 letters with a Sheffield postmark but no address. On Saturday last, he added, the girl returned home and fell on the floor saying, 'Oh mother, I shall die.' The father rushed outside and saw a motor car being driven away. The girl's sister said that when she asked who had brought it back, she said, 'the doc.'" End quote. Less than a fortnight later, the Daily Telegraph reported as quoted. Dr. John Blakely, 49, of School Road, Sheffield, appeared on remand at Sheffield's yesterday charged with the murder of Phyllis Staton, 25, an unemployed waitress. A further charge was preferred of unlawfully applying a drug for a certain purpose. Mr. J.W. Chant, prosecuting, said that during the past 18 months the woman had been continually in the company of Dr. Blakely. She left home on the 15th of January and her parents did not see anything more of her until the 3rd of February when there was a knock on the back door of the house and the girl fell in. Dr. Blakely was then seen driving away in his car. The woman died in hospital the next day from acute septicemia. Detective Superintendent Bristow produced a statement alleged to have been made by Dr. Blakely in which he said that he had given the woman some drugs but denied having carried out an illegal operation. He admitted intimacy with the girl but said that she had been with other men and that she had picked upon him because of his being better off than the others. Superintendent Bristow, in answer to Mr. F.W. Scorer defending, said that he could find no evidence to support any allegations about Miss Staton's relations with men. Dr. James Clark, Medical Superintendent of Sheffield City General Hospital, said there was no evidence of any illegal operation or the taking of drugs. Asked if it was possible for a medical man to procure an abortion without leaving any evidence, the doctor replied, "Yes, it is. The hearing was adjourned until today." End quote. Just the following day, on the 22nd of February 1934, the Daily Telegraph reported as quoted. After hearing the speech for the defence, the Sheffield magistrates last night dismissed the charges brought against Dr. John Blakely, 49, of the murder of an unemployed waitress, Phyllis Dayton, 25, and of supplying a certain drug to the girl knowing it to be intended for unlawful use. The presiding magistrate said the evidence was so weak that no jury would convict. For the prosecution, it was alleged that Dr. Blakely had procured a miscarriage in such way that a post-mortem would not implicate him and that a drug had been used. For the defence, Mr. F.W. Scorer said that the miscarriage was perfectly normal. There was no evidence that the accused had anything to do with it. End quote. David's father admitted to intimate relations with the late 25-year-old for at least 18 months, but gave no admission of carrying out an illegal operation on her, that she miscarried without intervention. It was suspected that John had carried out an under-the-table abortion on Phyllis, though no evidence could prove that he had done so, and with the court finding John to not have intentionally caused any harm to Phyllis, the charges were dropped. The scandal had seemingly no effect on John's business whatsoever, likely because the patients couldn't afford to have an opinion on the case in the state of the economic climate. Though the scandal didn't affect John's work as a doctor, it did, however, affect his marriage, which later ended in 1940, with David's mother Annie being granted a dissolution to the marriage on the grounds of adultery. Annie was remarried by February 1941, leaving behind the name Blakely to become Mrs. Cook. David, now 11 years old, gained a stepfather named Humphrey Cook, a rather wealthy man from a family of wholesale drapers. Humphrey Cook was a well-known racing car fanatic, which later opened doors for David's fascination with the sport. With David's older brothers leaving to serve in the forces, David attended a public school in Shrewsbury in North Wales. He wasn't particularly good at school, but this was likely due to his disinterest in his subjects. David later secured a commission and completed national service in the Highland Light Infantry, a regiment of the British Armed Forces. David's love was securely in motor racing, and though his stepfather had the means to support David's interest in motor racing, he wanted David to earn the means to pay for the sport himself. So, he opened the doors for David and got him a position as a trainee manager at the Hyde Park Hotel in the wealthy area of Knightsbridge, London. David was earning 50 shillings a week, which is around £80 in today's money. Alongside, he got a £5 allowance from Annie, which is around £160 today. It wasn't much, but it was much more than what David would have been able to obtain had it not been for the connections his parents provided. And though doors were open for David to eventually become a hotel manager once he'd completed his vigorous training, the long work hours for minimal pay took a toll on David's interest in the matter. He just wanted to race cars, but to race cars, he needed the money to do so. As he was struggling to get where he wanted on the wages and the allowance he had, he went to his mother Annie to try and bargain with her for more, explaining that he couldn't possibly find the high-caliber woman of the same social standard that was expected of him to settle down with such little money. But really, David had no interest in finding a woman to settle down with. Not right now. His interest was in finding the means to fund his love of motor racing, and his ambitions were ever taking a turn away from the hotel business directly to his true love of race cars. At home, David was living in an all-expenses-paid apartment in Mayfair with his brother Brian and his nanny. With a small but by all means luxurious home to live in, David's small wages were available for saving. Along the way working at the hotel, David would enjoy the company of women who were a bit older than him. He was attracted to the mother figure type of woman, who would baby him and enjoy doing so in the process. He would have the odd girlfriend here and there, nothing serious. However, if it was serious, he usually had another girlfriend on the side. When women would come to stay at the hotel, they were enticed by David's good looks and pleasant manners towards them. He'd often be taken by female guests for dinner and drinks, and it wasn't exactly difficult to find somewhere to lay should the pleasantries lead them there. It was an easy part of the job for David, and evidently both parties were having a good time when it happened. Whether it made sense or not, David's somewhat childish etiquette appeased the older woman. They'd mollycoddle him regardless of how he acted. His friends, however, wouldn't always tolerate his playfulness, landing himself a punch in the face from the Steering Wheels Club founder when David thought it'd be funny to spray him with soda water and put ice cubes down his shirt. Spraying others with the soda gun would be a practical joke that David would play several times in a playful and drunken state, regardless of the backlash he'd get each time. But all in all, David was a charming young man who seemed to get on with whomever he chose to. He continued his empty dating going into his early 20s and pushed through the monotonous training for the manager's position at the Hyde Park Hotel, using any money that he could get his hands on to fund his prospects at becoming a motor racer driver. It was no secret that David was trying to portray somewhat of a playboy image. He dressed that of a wealthier man, and though he lacked the funds to match, he was well-spoken and well-groomed, and he charmed his way around London's nightlife. He would buy drinks for friends and acquaintances when he had the means to. Still, at times, he would appear stuck-up and condescending to those who didn't look beneath the surface. David began fulfilling his dreams slowly but surely. With the wages that he had saved up from the hotel, alongside the allowance from his mother and a helpful financial contribution here and there from his stepfather, David was able to purchase his first sports car. In 1951, 23-year-old David had begun racing in club events, driving an ex-Le Mans lightweight HRG, a racing car that was competitive, rugged, and easy to maintain. David was content with his beautifully crafted car he could finally race with. There was, however, a distraction in the mix when David found what he thought was true love. A few months prior in 1951, David went with a friend to view an Alfa Romeo for sale in Hammersmith, London. A 29-year-old man named Anthony Findlater introduced himself as the seller of the car. It was with Anthony's wife Carol whom David would develop an infatuation with. 27-year-old Carol Findlater was the daughter of middle-class Jewish refugees who settled in the UK. She worked as a journalist before serving in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force in Hertfordshire. It was there that she met and fell in love with an RAF sergeant and former engineering student Anthony Findlater. After engaging in a long-distance relationship, Carol and Anthony married when Anthony returned from his posting to Italy after the war. Anthony designed cars and was devoted to motor racing on the side of a neon salesman job, while Carol worked as a sub-editor for Women magazine. She was earning £20 a week, which would be over £850 in today's money. Anthony took on small engineering jobs while Carol focused on her growing journalism career. It took less than half a decade for the marriage between Carol and Anthony to become stale. The honeymoon phase had fizzled a long while back, and the lack of excitement led to Carol's wandering eye. David, Carol and Anthony entered a love triangle when David called Anthony, the man he only knew as someone selling a car that he went to view with a friend. But when he purchased the HRG, he knew that Anthony was a fellow enthusiast, and David was happy to show it off to Anthony, just as happy as Anthony was to come and have a look at the HRG. This is where David and Anthony's relationship in the racing world began. Growing up, Anthony's father saw motor racing as lacking substance, something of a waste of time, but nothing could hold him back from partaking in the sport as an adult, apart from the fact that he himself couldn't afford a race car. But David reignited his dreams of being able to race by co-driving the HRG. Spending time with Anthony unavoidably led to spending time with his wife when they'd go out to clubs and restaurants together. And through this, 27-year-old Carol became infatuated with the 23-year-old David's good looks and charm. David too lusted after Carol, for she held the typical characteristics of his type: older, stronger-minded, wiser, and a mothering figure, all of what tickled David's fancy. David and Carol would continue an affair behind Anthony's back as David and Anthony worked on the HRG together and prepared to enter races. And by the end of the summer, after countless nights spent drinking together on secret dates behind Anthony's back, the two were madly in love. It overcame David that the two should run away together. He couldn't be without Carol, and he couldn't bear the thought of them continuing in such a scenario that David was having to share her with another man. To this, Carol, whose marriage to Anthony had been rocky for quite some time, decided that the desperate declaration of love was enough to decide that she would run away with David. And so, Carol went home to pack her bags to join David in a fantastical journey of love. Anthony unexpectedly caught Carol packing her bags, and upon discovery that Carol was leaving him, Anthony poured his heart out to Carol with a desperate plea for her to stay. And she did. Carol's world crashed back down to reality, and she realised that the romantic thoughts about David that her mind was convincing her were simply not true, at least not to an extent. She loved Anthony, and she wanted to remain in the marriage with him. When Carol broke the news to David that she in fact would not be leaving her marriage to run away with him, it started as a civilised discussion, but it ended in a vicious verbal attack when he learned Carol had revealed David to be the one that she was intending to run away with. David was enraged. He began screaming profanities at her. Now Anthony knew that he was the one responsible for almost ending their marriage. David yelled at Carol, "Who the hell will tune my car now?" Though David worried he had now ruined his relationship with Anthony, there was no need to. His relationship with Carol ended abruptly in that moment, but not even a betrayal of this standard could break the relationship between David and Anthony and their dreams and aspirations to achieve something wonderful together. With Anthony by his side, David raced the HRG in club events, and by 1952, David was racing at Goodwood and Silverstone, with Anthony and David sharing the drive-in during a 9-hour race. Moving on from the affair and David thriving with his progress in the racing world, David solidified that this is what he wanted to do. He didn't want to work a normal job, he didn't want to be tied down in a marriage, he just wanted to be free to race his splendid HRG. Unfortunately, to maintain a race car and travel across the country to enter races, David would need money, and there was only so much that he could stretch to afford on his trainee wages and allowance from his mother Annie, with Humphrey Cook treating him to some financial help here and there, which he especially needed when he was regularly spending a lot of money at clubs drinking with his friends, portraying the playboy image. As David struggled to manage his money, something bittersweet happened months earlier in February 1952 when David's father passed away suddenly at the age of 67. The loss of his father was a tragedy and it caused deep upset for David, but following the death he was left with a considerable amount of money in the will, an amount that would help David in all the ways that he needed. David went on to inherit £7,000, over £170,000 in today's money, an amount that would fund David's ever-growing ambition to be seen as the man about town, to be the playboy that he strived to be. It was around this time David met a woman named Linda Dawson, the daughter of a wealthy businessman. Linda was living in Huddersfield, over 190 miles away from the Hyde Park Hotel where she met David. David could tell by the way that Linda was dressed that she had money, or she was from money. Linda found David very attractive and was allured by the HRG that he drove. They began a relationship, and soon Linda would bring her family down to London to visit David with her, and David would travel to Huddersfield to visit Linda and her family, with David returning home only to brag to his friends of the apparent wealth that Linda's family showed. Sadly for Linda, she was unaware of David's antics when she wasn't around, regularly visiting the little club in Knightsbridge where he'd be making advances with hotel guests or hostesses at the club itself. David was never faithful to Linda. He was far from faithful, but she wasn't to know this, being so far away in Huddersfield. David continued his antics during the work hours, and in October 1952, when David was the cause of a broken rib by a lady subjected to his foolish behaviour, he was let go from his job at the Hyde Park Hotel. Naturally, David appeared at work the following day, not to work of course, but to sit at the hotel bar and drink himself into a stupor. Now that David was free from his job as a trainee hotel manager, It was up to his mother Annie to try and convince David of some ambition in life. Presumably, she was aware David had plenty of ambition, though it wasn't directed anywhere towards work. Annie took David on a world cruise where David had the time of his life visiting different countries and cultures, though spending much of the voyage drinking and even causing mischief when he was drinking at port. One time almost missing a departure because of his drunken socialising. When they returned from the cruise in 1953, Annie was let down by the fact that David wasn't immediately ready to settle into a new job. Instead, he found himself a new girlfriend alongside his relationship with Linda. The new girlfriend was of course an older woman. She came to London as part of her job as a model. However, she was married. Though nothing came of the short-winded romance, the relationship just ended there. But eventually, David agreed to take on an engineering job with a firm named Silicon Pistons in Penn, where David's mother and stepdad Humphrey Cook had recently moved. They now lived in an upper-middle-class area of Penn in Buckinghamshire. Penn is within the Chiltern area of outstanding beauty, in the heart of the countryside, and here David was given a wing of his parents' house to live in while he worked for Silicon Pistons. Though David decided to spend much of his time back in his home in London, the other property provided to him by his parents. And of course, it was in London where David continued affiliations with his fellow motor racing enthusiasts in the club, spending excessive time and money drinking, living up to his playboy image. It was from the influence of Ruth's relationship with the motor racing clients that brought the idea to Maurice Connolly that Ruth should be the manageress of another of his clubs, ingeniously named the Little Club on Brompton Road in Knightsbridge. In Ruth's eyes, she was given a pretty sweet deal as part of the position. She had a flat on top of the club and a base salary of £15 per week, with every opportunity to make more money on top of that if she worked the room the way that she was known to, even more if she worked the bedroom too. Ruth took this position on with gratitude. She was extremely proud of herself for the accomplishment and proud of her new title as club manageress. When it came down to serving her first customer at the Little Club, it just so happened to be David Blakely. David had been sneaking out of work at the Hyde Park Hotel during the daytime to drink at the Little Club for a while. It might have come to a surprise for David to see Ruth as the new manageress, as much as a surprise it was for Ruth to see the rude man that irked her some time ago at Carol's. Regardless, Ruth welcomed him politely and professionally, putting the right foot forward in her new role. David appeared rather unfazed by the interaction, and as he'd done so many times, he returned to drink at the Little Club. Over time, the staff had coined him the nickname Loverboy, because Ruth had begun an infatuation with David. He was charming and handsome after all, and he was of a higher social class, and that's what she aspired to become a part of. After a few weeks of Ruth hosting David at the club, David propositioned Ruth to sleep with him upstairs in her flat. She agreed. It wasn't out of the ordinary for Ruth to take clients of the club to bed, and David seemed to have plenty of money to do so, and so they went to bed. From this, a new routine was formed. Ruth would work her shift as the manageress of the Little Club, ending the night by taking David to bed. David was spending every Monday to Friday in Ruth's flat, regardless of his engagement to Linda. To David, he'd found another interesting older woman to spend time with, though regardless of the time spent with Ruth, he was still devoted to the idea of marrying Linda for her inheritance money. Neither David nor Ruth felt adoration for each other in the early days, but that didn't stop them from continuing their bedtime routine. Ruth carried on her call girl duties, having to do so around David's schedule so that he wouldn't catch her in the act of doing so, because he expressed that it worried him, and she didn't want to worry him, but she had to earn a living, and so she would do this on the down low, away from David's prying eyes. In 1954, Ruth fell pregnant with David's child, and though she decided she wasn't going to continue with the pregnancy, David momentarily offered for Ruth to marry and raise the child together. Likely only an idea resulting from a drunken mind, but Ruth didn't feel it was necessary to enter a marriage, not after the previous experiences that she'd been faced with. And deep down, David felt safe offering the proposal to Ruth, almost knowing full well that she would decline and continue with determination, for her focus was now the club. David called Ruth regularly to check upon her after she went through the procedure, an act that would have Ruth believing that David cared for her well-being. However, none of this changed the fact that he was going to marry Linda, nor did it change the fact that Ruth was still working the bedroom with other men. David and Ruth would go on dates together. They'd go to the theatre for dinner, stopping by at the clubs where Ruth's friends hosted, ever so pleased to show the young, charming and handsome David off. And David started taking Ruth along to motor races. He too was pleased to show off how his sophisticated and accomplished older woman looked to his friends, boasting about the no-strings-attached affair that he had with Ruth, and boasting about her well-practiced skills in the bedroom, thinking that this would impress his older motor racing friends. Ruth's hatred for men soon seemed to fizzle when it came to David. He had broken down her emotional barriers, and whether she admitted it or not, she was deeply emotionally invested in David. Had it not been for the fact that she was unavailable in the sense that she was yet to divorce George Ellis, and that David had his sights strongly set on marrying Linda, she might have considered a life wed to David. The affair continued, and eventually it wasn't all fun and games for Ruth anymore. Over time, she grew frustrated with David. Since David insisted on staying with Ruth throughout the week after partying at the club, she was now having to pay rent to keep him there, which was not in the original deal when she took on the job. David didn't offer to pay his way for staying with Ruth, the same way he didn't offer a contribution for the abortion, with Ruth knowing full well that he had more than enough spare change at the time to relieve her of the hardship in the situation. On top of this, David would muck about in the club after a few too many, and he'd get in a temper when others around him didn't react too kindly to his behaviour, which was causing a problem for Ruth given that she was the manageress and had to deal with any issues around staff and clients. And David was still a client of the club, regardless of what relations were going on behind closed doors with Ruth. David's childish behaviour whilst drunk at the little club became ever more problematic. The situation grated on Ruth, long enough that she didn't feel it to be completely necessary for them to continue the affair. They did, however, continue the affair. As David's inheritance started to wear thin through excessive spending around the clubs and pubs, pumping money into and attending races, and the upkeep of his beloved racing car, David began pouncing off Ruth. Pouncing is an old slang term for a man living off a woman's earnings. Ruth would pay for their meals at restaurants, she'd pay for David to drink at the club, and she'd lend him money that she would never see back. She was now having to pay £10 a week for the rent of the flat that she was originally provided as part of her job. This in turn made Ruth's money wear thin. The problem wasn't only that David was living as a kept man, it was that Ruth could no longer afford to keep David, because over time he had become so wildly jealous of her job that he was making it increasingly difficult for her to earn money at all. Her entire career at the clubs was built around the flirtatious rapport with clients, earning commissions from convincing the punters to spend as much money as possible, and earning the real money when she would work the bedroom alongside the club duties. However, David had become infuriated with Ruth flirting as part of her job, with it starting as a passive-aggressive jealousy that Ruth initially thrived off, seeing as she found David to be the one playing hard to get at the beginning. The jealousy had now turned into physical violence, and once the violence started, it would only get worse. One time, David participated in a motor race, with Ruth providing the usual champagne picnic for David's friends as she attended, cheering him on, but when David failed to secure a victory, he blamed Ruth for the loss, convinced it was her fault because they arrived later than expected, and in turn he punished Ruth with a beating. Ruth was incredibly upset, but just as the times before, she didn't cut ties with David. You have heard part 1 of the Ruth Ellis story. Come back for part 2 of the story of David Blakely and Ruth Ellis.